Kendriya Vidyalaya Sangathan and Zonal Institute of Education and Training Mumbai presents video course presentation for Class 10 Science. So Class 10 Science Chapter 9, namely Heredity and Evolution. This is the fourth session. In this session, we will be talking about the laws of inheritance and in particular about monohybrid cross. Students, please remember, we have to read our textbook thoroughly and make our own notes for proper learning. The targeted learning outcomes of this session is to construct a monohybrid cross and calculate the ratio of offspring using a Punnett square and to develop critical thinking. All the peas in a pea pod do not look alike. They vary in number, they vary in color of the seeds, they also vary in the shape of the seeds. The information coded in the DNA, which is present in the chromosome of a cell, constitutes what is called the genotype. We'll talk about this a little later, but the expression of this genotype is what we also refer to as phenotype. If we take parental plants of garden pea, which are pure breeding for one trait, namely color of the seed, we find two distinct forms, namely yellow color seed and green color seed. On cross-pollination and cross-fertilization of these two pure breeding varieties, Mendel found that he got the F1 generation, all plants bearing yellow color seed. Allowing these F1 plants to self-pollinate and self-fertilize after growing, he found it gave rise to the F2 generation. Collecting all the seeds of F2 generation, when he studied them, he found almost 75% of the progeny were bearing yellow color seeds and the balance 25% of the progeny were bearing green color seeds. In our earlier session, we studied that Mendel performed a large number of experiments using garden peas. He cultivated almost 28,000 plants in a span of about 7 years. He also studied 7 different traits in pea plants, and he observed that each trait had 2 distinct contrasting forms. He cultivated pure breeding varieties for each form of the trait, and therefore he had 14 different pure breeding varieties readily available with him. For example, when he crossed a pure breeding tall plant with that of a pure breeding dwarf plant, he got the F1, all showing tall plants. But on selfing this F1, he got the F2 generation, which was in the ratio of 2.84 tall plants is to 1 dwarf plant, which is almost 3:1. He did individual experiments for each of these 6 traits I should say, and he got almost the same ratio of 3:1. That particular form of the trait which expressed itself in the F1 and did not express itself in the F1, he classified them as dominant trait and recessive trait. So for example, if tallness was exhibiting itself in the F1, it became the dominant trait, and if dwarfness did not express itself, it became what was called the recessive trait. Mendel was the first to talk about particulate inheritance. Knowingly or unknowingly, he stated that the physical traits are inherited as particles. Later on, these particles are also referred to as factors in many places. He did not know that the particles were actually chromosomes or DNA. It was the studies in science and technology in later years that confirmed that it was the chromosomes and DNA which bear the traits for a particular organ. Let us now study a monohybrid cross. A monohybrid cross is a cross where we consider only one particular trait. In this case, let us take up seed shape. The two forms of the trait are round seeds and wrinkle seeds. Pure breeding varieties of round seeds are represented by R, and the pure breeding varieties of wrinkle seeds are represented by r. The reason being, when we cross these two pure breeding varieties, we get the F1 generation, where the F1 generation, although they are represented as R, they exhibit a phenotype of all round, which means the dominant form of the trait is roundness and the recessive form of the trait is wrinkled seeds. Therefore, we denote the seed shape by capital R for round seeds and small r for wrinkled seeds. The F1, where even though the phenotype is all round, the genotype is represented as capital R small r because it derives one capital R from one of the parents and one small r from the other parent, where the capital R and small r are actually the alleles for the particular trait. So we could say the allele for roundness is represented by capital R and the allele for wrinkledness is represented by small r. If we represent the monohybrid cross that we just studied in the form of a square, we call it a Punnett square. The round seeded plants are represented by capital R. Therefore, the gametes produced by this plant will be mentioned or shown as capital R or capital R, while the gametes produced by the plants which bear wrinkled seeds denoted by small r could again segregate or separate to form two possible gametes, namely bearing either small r or small r. Depending on which come together, we would have a possible combination of capital R small r, capital R small r, capital R small r, capital R small r. That means all the possible offsprings here in the F1 generation are denoted as capital R small r. Since all the F1 are resembling only round seeds, therefore we call roundness form of the trait to be dominant over the wrinkled form of the trait. So we could write the F1 generation, the genotype is capital R small r, while the phenotype is round seeds. Genotypic ratio is all alike and phenotypic ratio is also all alike. So we would like to review monohybrid cross. We could say that on crossing a homozygous dominant parent with a homozygous recessive parent, we get the offspring all who are heterozygous or hybrids. The offspring called the F1 generation or also the first filial generation. The genotypic and phenotypic ratio of the first filial generation is all alike. But when we proceed further and do F1 into F1 in the monohybrid cross for the same trait, namely seed shape, whose alleles are capital R for round and small r for wrinkled, the cross of course is round seeds crossed with round seeds. Because this is F1 into F1, we get capital R small r into capital R small r, which means that the gametes could either bear capital R or small r from one parent, and the gametes of the second parent would again be either capital R or small r. Putting all the four possible combinations together in the form of the allelic combination of the possible offsprings, we get either capital R or capital R small r or capital R small r and small r small r. If we would like to put the ratios, we could say 1 out of 4 is capital R, 2 out of 4 is capital R small r, and 1 out of 4 is small r small r. In other words, the genotypes possible in the offspring are capital R or capital R or small r small r. And the phenotype, of course, would either be round or wrinkled. But when we talk about the genotypic ratio, we get the genotypic ratio of 1:2:1 such that capital R is to capital R is to small r small r. While the phenotypic ratio is represented as 3:1 such that round is to wrinkled. In other words, crossing a heterozygous parent with another heterozygous parent, we get the offspring which shows 25% homozygous dominant, represented here as capital R, 50% as heterozygous, namely capital R small r, and 25% is homozygous recessive, represented here as small r small r. All these offsprings constitute what we also call as the F2 generation. The genotypic ratio of this F2 generation is represented as 1:2:1 such that capital R is to capital R is to small r small r. And the phenotypic ratio is represented as 3:1 such that round. So we can sum up the results of the monohybrid cross as inheritable factors or genes are responsible for all inheritable characteristics. Phenotype is based on genotype. Each trait is based on a gene which is made up of two alleles, one from the mother and one from the father. And true breeding individuals are homozygous. That means both the alleles are the same or identical. Now you have to practice your crosses. Try to work out P1, F1 and F2 for the crosses of the following 7 pairs of traits for garden pea, some of which I have listed, namely pure tall crossed with pure dwarf, or pure axial flowers crossed with pure terminal flowers, or pure purple flowers crossed with pure white flowers, and so on. Thank you. We'll learn more in our next video.